All right, welcome back to the program. Hour number 3. It is 8 minutes now after 2 o'clock on this Friday afternoon, and we're going to change topics for just a bit here today because we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do Budget 101. We're all going to get an education on the budgeting process here in the city because every one of us is a genius. We all know how the money should be spent. We all know what is not being done with the money, and everybody claims to be a genius. We all know where it's at, except the people who are in charge of spending the money. So we've got Ari Sky with us. He is the Chief Financial Officer for the City of New Bedford, and we're going to talk about the mayor's budget that was presented to the City Council on Wednesday night, and we're going to pick it apart a little bit and try to get a sense of exactly where your money is being spent. And hi, Ari, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Barry. I'm happy to be here.
Glad to have you. So what exactly is the mayor asking for fiscal 19, which begins on July 1st?
We haven't got a lot. It's a very tight budget this year. The entire budget's about $370 million. That's an increase over last year. Most of what's driving that are things that are kind of beyond our control. There are a number of mandated expenses that have to do with pension and health care and things like that. The school budget is essentially set. The minimum school budget is set by the state. It's called net school spending, and most of the additional state money is going to that. And then we have a few collective bargaining agreements that are coming into play this year with police, fire, EMS, and AFSCME. After that, there's not much. I think of all the positions in there are hundreds of positions in the city government, and the budget request, I think there are 2 additional positions in the general fund and a few positions in the enterprise funds. So there's not much new, and that's unfortunate. It's certainly not for lack of desire. The mayor, as you know, has a fairly ambitious agenda of things he wants to do to improve the city. And it's unfortunate that on a year-by-year basis, I know that he gets frustrated. We just don't have the resources to be able to do all those things. So what we try to do is keep us on a sustainable path that'll work going forward.
So $378 million. How much of that actually comes from tax revenue? And how much of that comes maybe from state grants and local aid and all that kind of stuff?
So I'm going to do the Budget 101 part here. All right. So the city budget is divided into several operating funds. The biggest one by far is the general fund. That's about $340 million. There are also a number of much smaller funds. There's the water that are funded by special fees. There's a fund that's supported by water fees, a fund supported by wastewater fees. The airport is self-supporting. There's a downtown parking fund, which is mainly the parking garages and parking facilities like meters around downtown. There's the Arts and Culture Fund, which was created last year. That's about $100,000 of our room occupancy tax that gets diverted into that fund on an annual basis, and that's pretty much it. So the general fund is where people's the real estate taxes go. The general fund, as I said, totals about $338 million. About $175 million of that is state revenue. There's something called the Chapter 70 program, which supports education aid. There's unlimited general government aid. They used to call it lottery money, which goes to localities. The Baker administration has, as long as they've been in office, have committed toward increasing that number by the same amount as general revenue in the state. So this year goes up by about 3.5%, I believe. Then property taxes are about $124 million, depending on what the city council does with the budget and so on. And then there's about $30-odd million in departmental revenues, things like building permits and treasurer fees. Let's see, what other things, things along those lines. That EMS fees, ambulance fees that go towards offsetting department operations. So the amount of money that of the $370 million altogether that people pay in taxes actually comes just about to a quarter of the total.
All right, so all the rest come in from the other sources.
Fees,
All right, so the water and the sewer, those are enterprise accounts, right?
Yeah, enterprise
they
funds.
basically pay for themselves through the fees that they charge. They're self-sustaining.
Right.
Okay, so that's why people pay the water bills they pay and the sewer fees.
They usually pay a single bill, a water sewer bill, and it gets divided into water and sewer.
Now, are they the only 2 enterprise funds that we have?
No, the airport is an enterprise fund. It's self-supporting. The downtown enterprise fund, which is the parking garages, that's self-supporting. And there is the Arts and Culture Fund, which is a special revenue fund, it's not an enterprise fund, which was created by special legislation. You may recall, Mayor, I think, talked about it at some point last year by designating a portion of our room occupancy tax towards arts and culture.
All right. What about the zoo? Is the zoo?
The zoo is a general fund department.
That's a general, so that gets funded from the city general fund as well as through grants.
They have their society, which is a private organization, provides an awful lot of support to the zoo, and for example, this year the council is considering a capital bond. There's $870,000 worth of work for the zoo, and then that's going to be matched just about a little over 1-for-1 by the society. So that shows you how much money they're able to raise. They get donations and so on and help support the zoo operations.
All right. So in addition to the property taxes that I pay and you pay and businesses pay and that type of thing. And you mentioned the Chapter 70, which is education. We get some Chapter 90 money to fix roads, all these different things from the state. What other sources of revenue do the city have? Is that it? I mean, is that... you mentioned the fees and that type of thing.
Fees like EMS fees are a big number.
Right.
We collect I think it's about $6 million a year in ambulance fees. It's a big amount of money. And between sort of meters outside of the downtown zone and the and violation fees, that's about $1.5 million that the city collects, for parking and enforcement. There's building permits are about 1.3 million, things like that. They're smaller compared to the tax number, but they do add up. It comes to about $30+ million worth of those.
All right,
fees.
people often ask me, and I don't know the answer to this, and that's why I'm glad you're here, so I can ask you, how much does the fishing industry, because we're always told that the fishing industry is the number one port in the country, we bring in a lot of money. How much does the fishing industry actually contribute, and in what way?
I'm not sure about the exact number, but there was a study done about 1.5 years ago by the port that looked at the economic activity generated by the fishing industry. And as I recall, the number listed for state and local tax revenue generated was about $200 million. My guess is that the local piece, local piece is a portion of that, but it's a fairly small portion. I'm not sure of the exact number. There are a number of large parcels down at the waterfront that generate a good amount of tax revenue, though.
Yeah. I mean, the fishing industry doesn't write a check to the City of New Bedford and say, here we go, it's a check from the industry.
Nope.
But I mean, it gets filtered into the economy through...
There's things like, there's boat excise tax, there's property tax from those properties. The waterfront properties are worth a lot. They have pretty good sized tax assessments, most of them, especially if they have bulkhead. And then there's, indirectly sales tax and things like that, things that are sold, even meals tax, local restaurants that sell, locally brought fish. That's also, money that we eventually get.
Now, does the city collect any money from the local option tax? I know the legislature approved that. It allows communities. I know we were in Gloucester fairly recently, and we got our bill for the meal, and we got the sales tax on top of it, and then the local option tax on that. That the communities.
So we have the local option meals tax.
Okay.
We get about $1.3 million a year. We have the room occupancy taxes, which at some point were a local option a long time ago. They've been accepted a long time. Those raise a couple $100,000 a year.
Where does that go, in the general account?
It's general fund, yeah. And then excise taxes on cars and vehicles, which one could argue is a piece of that's generated by the fishing industry too, because they have vehicles. That's a big number. It's about $8.2 million a year in revenue that we get from motor vehicle excise tax.
Now, were the excise taxes not targeted for a phase out at one point and then came back, or what happened?
Well, there's something about sales tax, state sales tax. You're talking about that?
I thought the excise tax. Well, I know that they're talking about lowering the state sales tax.
Yeah, talking about they've been lowering the state sales tax. There's another referendum to lower it further.
Right.
The excise tax now. That's I'm not aware of any efforts to reduce that at the moment. But of course, having been here 5.5 years, there's things that happened beforehand.
Sure. And short-term rentals, I know that's something that the legislature's been trying to deal with, and I guess it's not going to go anywhere this session.
Doesn't look like it now.
Is there any money in that for the City of New Bedford?
Potentially.
Do we do any of that?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we get some.
That would be like B&B and those kind of places.
We do get some money from bed and breakfasts already, things like that. But the short-term rental reform that they're talking about, I know the Massachusetts Municipal Association has been very involved in that. I'm on the Fiscal Policy Committee. And there's been a lot of work going on in terms of structuring a bill that provides the right sort of does the licensing control. And I understand there's some controversy up in Boston over that right now because the Mayor Walsh has been trying to impose their own local controls, and also creates a revenue structure to support that, and also to provide some revenue to localities. My understanding is that that's probably moving on to the next session.
Yeah, that's what I understand as well. Would that now would that be a local option or would that be statewide? What they're talking about doing?
There's a component of it that would be local option. So there's like many state taxes, what the state does is they create their tax, and then they give the localities an option to piggyback on. Marijuana is like that. There's a 3% local option tax on marijuana, which is moving through the city council now. So that's.
Let's go back. I want to go to the marijuana just a second.
Okay,
if I can write it right down here so I don't forget it. But you mentioned the state sales tax, and there is a move to get a question on the ballot to do that. The legislature doesn't appear to be ready to tackle that issue. But if we do go to the polls in November and we vote to lower the state sales tax from 6.25% down to 5%, how does that hit New Bedford?
That doesn't hit New Bedford directly because they're lowering the state portion. They're not lowering the local option piece.
Okay.
But it would have an impact on, you could argue, and this is a policy matter. I don't want to dive too much into policy, but you could argue that, by reducing the resources available at the state, we are a locality that depends quite a bit on state revenue. As I said before, we get about $174 million a year in state revenue. And the pot gets a little smaller. So.
All right. But it could generate more business locally, too.
In theory. Yeah.
And that could offset,
Sure.
right? Yeah. I believe in you lower taxes, people are going to go out and spend more money. So that might help out. Who knows? We'll see, I guess. On the marijuana thing, have we got any idea what we are going to, any estimates at all, what we're going to see in terms of a benefit from marijuana through taxes?
I think it's too early to say. The field is still defining itself. I know that we have one cultivation center that's coming in. There's been, I know, a lot of interest from dispensaries. The city has this moratorium on until September 30th, I believe. That was to give time to do the zoning and, get things structured the way they want it to be. Also to, look at the local option sales tax portion, so create the regime, and that's moving along well from what I understand. And, I imagine we'll see some results of where this all goes in the fall.
So we don't have any projections in terms of what...
Not at this point, no.
Because there were a lot of unknowns.
Right,
still.
and it would be highly premature for me to count on anything revenue-wise. So
right, because at any given moment, Jeff Sessions can say, "Hey guys, guess what, guys, you're not doing this."
That's true.
So
that's true. That's a very good point, Barry. I mean, there's a great deal of uncertainty at the national level regarding which way this goes, which can't be helpful from an economic standpoint, I wouldn't think.
Right. All right. So education. What does the state contribute to our education budget? About 85%.
Thereabouts. I think the let's see, Chapter 70 is about 143 million or so. Our local share that we pay is in the neighborhood of 40-ish million. So you can kind of do the math there. That includes all the indirect. The school budget is about 100 as proposed would be about 137 million, and then there's a whole lot of indirect costs that aren't directly in the school budget, things like healthcare and retirement, and stuff like that.
And of course, step increases each year.
And they have those costs that they have to, the New Bedford has historically budgeted at net school spending, which is the minimum number allowable that the state, allows you to budget at.
So we're right there. We're right at minimum.
We're right there. We don't go much more than we don't go anything more than we have to.
Right.
There's been a lot of discussion and debate about that over the years. The school committee and the superintendent have obviously always wanted more, and it's totally understandable. And the meantime, we kind of balance the other side, which is trying to keep the impact on tax bill as bearable as possible.
And you can't go below that number,
right.
I think more than 5%, or they come after you, right?
If you do go below, and if you're less than 5%, it creates a penalty scenario where the following year you're required to make that number up.
Right. So then you're basically building in a structural deficit, and you
Correct.
don't want to do that. So, all right. So in terms of expanding the amount of money that the city can bring in, I mean, there really are few options for us, right? I mean, we are pretty much set in what we can bring in. We don't have a lot of space to develop new tax-paying industry or anything. So how do we do that? How do we? Because obviously our costs, whether it be healthcare, pensions, whatever, goes up every year. Cost of education. So how do we, without going back to the taxpayers every year and saying we need you to pony up more? How do we bring more revenue into the city?
So it's about developing it's about a redevelopment strategy, and that's something that I know the mayor's been very committed to, and that's trying to bring in new business, trying to bring in tourism dollars and things like that. The more money you bring in from outside, of course, the less money you have to collect internally. It's the nature of the drivers behind our budget are such, and I've been saying this for some time now, so I'm pretty consistent, are such that there will always be upward pressure. The key is to try to keep that sustainable, and the definition of sustainability kind of varies depending on who you're talking to. For someone like me, if I was living in isolation, it would just be a matter of, stay within that 2.5%, Prop 2.5 number, and that's sustainable. But of course, that means everybody gets a tax increase. And I'm a taxpayer myself, and I feel the hit every year too. So I certainly know what the real world impact is on people as well. It's a tough balance, and some of the harder discussions we have during the budget process really circle around kind of the want to haves versus the need to haves. This budget is, I'm not using hyperbole when I say this budget is almost all need to haves and very little want to haves.
So what is our, I guess the major hits on our budget would be healthcare, pension liability, and of course the charter school thing is huge too. So let's take them one by one. What is the healthcare costs? And I know the mayor's been asking the city council to revisit that issue and give him the authority to have, I guess, more negotiating power and going to an arbitrator and that type of thing in order to change what our policy is, not necessarily a commitment, but what the policy is. And so what is the hit on us for healthcare annually?
So healthcare and pension will go up by about $2.1 million next year. We're using a little bit of we're being a little bit creative in the way we're handling healthcare to try to keep the increase down a little bit next year, but it's kind of a short-term solution. We had some good experience at the beginning of this year. It means that our budget's going to be a little bit below, so we're going to be able to prepay some of next year's costs by spending up to budget this year. So that'll help the number for next year's budget, but it's not it's a one-year thing. And if it wasn't for that, the number would be more in the threes. So we lucked out a little bit there. But it's still a big hit, and it's gone up a lot over time. I mean, just a few years ago, the health insurance budget alone, healthcare budget alone, was in the mid-30s, around 35, 36. It's now up to 44. So it's just onward pressure. And when you only have a couple $1 million in new growth, which is what we call new tax development, new tax revenue that isn't from a tax increase, but just from people doing stuff, building stuff or improvements and that kind of thing. You can see how that goes. The checkbook. It's hard to balance the checkbook in that situation.
So, what roughly is our financial contribution to the healthcare and pensions next year out of this $378 million? We're looking at how much
about $44 million is healthcare and $29 million is pensions. Okay. So then you count FICA tax and another couple million. So that's between about
$75 million out of this is pension.
Of the $338 million in the general fund is that.
All right. So what about the charter school hit? How is that? Because I guess under the law, the money follows the child, right? If the child leaves the public school, goes to a charter school. So some would argue that by leaving you're spending that money on that kid in public school anyway. So if they go to a charter school, what's the big difference?
So what that does is affect the bottom line for the school budget. So if one accepts that the school budget is structurally underfunded, it just makes the problem worse. So in other words, if we had no charter schools, say we have $14 million going out the door for charter schools in 19. If we had no charter schools, then the basic net school spending number for the schools would be $14 million higher. It wouldn't free up $14 million in tax revenue. It would just allow us to have a higher school budget and still be at the minimum for net school spending. So the argument is more kind of starving resources in the school department to do things like, no matter whatever few hundred kids you have in a charter school, you still have to have the same number of buildings you're maintaining and classrooms and things like that. So you have infrastructure deficits and things along those lines, and that's really where it hurts them.
All right. So how much are we talking about? I know the mayor has talked a lot about the need to go back and revisit repairing buildings and all of this kind of stuff, because for many years we never did that.
Yeah.
So how much are we committing to actually taking care of the infrastructure, the school buildings and all those kind of things?
So our debt service budget's about $11.8 million this year. It's up a little bit from last year, a few $100,000.
That's just what we're paying on our
on debt. But that is really the.
What I was going to ask you, it's written right here. What is our bonded debt at this point?
That's our total bond. What's our total?
That would be a bonded debt is the amount of money that we borrowed and bonded for.
So that's a little bit complicated, because it's a combination of general fund debt and enterprise fund debt, but it's about $230 million altogether outstanding. So some of that's water, some of that's sewer. I'm not sure the breakdown, but and a good chunk of that.
That would be what? Improvements to the water and sewer facilities?
Renovations
the delivery, the infrastructure for delivering that.
I think the general fund components somewhere in the low hundreds.
All right, so we're in debt for about $230 million. And so what's our monthly car payment here? How do we pay that? Is there an annual payment, a monthly payment?
Yeah, it's debt service payment. It's annual. The general fund debt service is about $11.8 million, $11.7 million.
Each year we have to pay toward that.
And then each of the enterprise funds have several $1 million a year that they have to pay.
So at what point do we get to when we say, hey, you know what, we just can't afford to borrow anymore?
Well, hopefully never, because if that does happen, then either I or the person in my chair isn't doing their job well. The thing when I first came here, one of the first things the mayor really sort of top of my list from the mayor was developing a capital improvement program. So we have a 5-year capital improvement program, which is intended to project out debt over time, make sure it's manageable, make sure our numbers don't tick up in a way. We're retiring every year somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 to $9 million in debt. So what we try to do is issue debt and fit within that profile, if you know what I mean. Sometimes that isn't possible. Sometimes if you're building a new generally elementary schools, new schools, those will be big hits. It'll be $13, $14 million hits, and you can't quite do it. But for the most part, the capital bonds that we do, which are typically $5 to $6 million, are intended to fit within that profile.
These are like what, 20, 30-year bonds?
Yeah, it depends. The state law has all sorts of rules regarding how long you can amortize certain types of work. So some of them are 30. I don't think we have any 30s. Some of them are 25. Some of them are 20. Some cases, mainly IT infrastructure, it's SB 5. It varies.
Okay. So the bond rating determines what our rate is.
And the bond rating is your cost of carrying. It's very important. If your bond rating goes south, then your capital program cost goes north.
In layman's terms, that basically means like your interest rate went up, right?
It's a little bit like when you go to buy a car and they run your FICO score, and they look at your FICO. The car dealer looks at your FICO score and offers you a loan based on your FICO score. If you had a high FICO score, maybe they'll give you a loan for 2%. If you have a score in the 400s or 500s, they may deny or they may offer you a loan, but the rate will be like 7 or 8%.
And that impacts your payments, obviously.
Sure. Yeah.
So the amount of money that you're going to be on the hook for each year goes up if your bond rating goes down.
Right.
Okay, so now the average person listening to this at home is saying, look, we got a budget of $378 million. The state gives us $174 million, and we're bonded another $235 million. If I ran my house like that, I'd be bankrupt. So how do governments get away with doing all of that?
Well, we're not bonding $235 million to pay for operating costs. That's for capital work.
Right.
The piece that's associated with that $338 million is $11 million, which is our debt service. So it's a lot like you have a house that's worth $250,000. You earn $60,000, $70,000 a year. You pay mortgage on that house, and that's what our debt service is. The school budget is $137 million. I think the mayor said this. I have even said this yesterday. About fully 85% of our budget is basically set, and it's either set through collective bargaining agreements, through net school spending, or through pension or health benefits, which is one of the reasons why the administration has been pushing so hard on healthcare redesign and trying to bend that curve. it's really important that we do that in some form. So those discussions are ongoing.
It seems as though that's pretty much a dead end at this point.
We're meeting with the Public Employee Committee. That's the union committee, and there've been ongoing meetings. And there's a little movement here, a little movement there, but it is a slow, grueling process. So
All right. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take a break because we're running late, and I want to get all the breaks in, and I want to give folks a chance to call in with your questions. 508-996-0500. We'll do that right after this break right here on 1420 WBSM. Stay with us. All right, welcome back to the program. It is a Friday afternoon. It is 2:35, and everybody's probably getting ready to whoop it up tonight, right? Friday night. I remember when I was happy about Friday night. It's been a long time since I've been out on a Friday night, Ari. I don't know. Now I'm lucky if I can stay awake and watch the game, before I fall asleep.
I got my kids in town this weekend for Mother's Day, so it's all good.
Awesome. Great stuff. Yeah, mine is in town, too, from Colorado. So, all right, we've got Ari Sky with us. He's the Chief Financial Officer for the City of New Bedford. We're talking budgets. Just before we get to the phones, there was one other thing I wanted to ask you about, and that was privatization. And that has been something that we've seen New Bedford dabble with. We privatized the trash. Yep. Some years back. Is that still a good deal? Is that still working for us?
Oh, yeah, certainly it's a good deal. The nature of the trash market's a little bit, solid waste market's a little bit volatile. So, the costs go up and down and things like that. But for the most part, it certainly has, if you think about the fact that with in-source trash collection, if we had done it ourselves, you'd have 30 odd people who would all be on our retirement plan and on our health plan and everything else. It's much more cost effective for the city to, not to mention workers' comp and all that stuff. It's a lot more cost effective for the city to contract that out.
Now, other areas, I know the mayor had told me on the program, I don't know, maybe sometime last year, that the zoo was an area that we were looking at privatization. Turn it down, you said?
Turn it down a little bit.
Turn it down just a little bit. How's that?
Better, thank you.
Okay, I'm blowing his ears out here. Yeah, the zoo was an area that was up potentially for privatization.
There's a study underway about that right now. Yeah.
Okay.
We've been looking at fleet as well. I don't know that we would, we're not looking at totally outsourcing fleet, but there are things like part supply and, sort of a partial.
What is fleet? What do you mean fleet?
The city's fleet. city's car
vehicles.
Yeah, yeah, maintenance of the fleet
All
management.
right, so the city garage and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
All right,
so the garage, not so much the garage itself, but the parts supply process, things like that. Those are all potential areas that there might be some possibility.
Okay, where are we at with the zoo? I mean, you said a study is going on?
It's underway. Yeah. I think we're waiting on findings from the consultant, but there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of sharing of data, and things along those lines.
How would that work? We'd get
well, there's a lot of possible potential models. If
the Dunkin' Donuts Zoo, or would it be?
I don't think they're looking for something quite that corporate, but I think the idea would be that you'd have a private entity, which would basically consist of the zoo management and the zoo staff and things along those lines, and maybe combined with the Friends, and they would receive a payment from the city, a set payment on an annual basis. It's a little bit like when I was my prior life, I worked in Virginia for a long time, and the use of a park authority is very common down there. The idea behind a park authority is that they'll run parks, they'll run golf courses, they'll use revenue from, they'll be a little more entrepreneurial because they have to be self-supporting, and they get a certain amount of money from the municipal government just to maintain the operation. But it's a fixed amount, and it goes up incrementally. So there's a lot more certainty behind it.
Okay, so there's a possibility that we can do that with the zoo. Okay, any of the other parks, or?
That would probably that alone is going to be a big one. We're not so much looking at parks in general, because to make that work, it really has to be a revenue producer. Right. You have to have some revenue producers, but rather you're just throwing good money after bad. That if you just say, okay, now you're a private entity, do what you want, we'll give you this much money, period. I mean, it does in theory protect the city from big increases in cost, but it doesn't really, because in the long run, there's sympathy for the product and for the service, and people will want it supported. So you really got to make it real. You need to figure out a business model that works.
So how do you do? I mean, do you put it out to bid?
Eventually, you'd have to. Yeah, by law, you have to put out the operation to bid. Okay. Yeah.
Anything else that we can privatize? Anything under consideration? There's
been some talk about things like grounds maintenance and things like that. We did a study of that. We found, at least for the time being, that it made sense to keep that internal, mainly because of the way the city does other functions with those staff. So during the wintertime, we have a very efficient snow removal operation. In the wintertime, we use our own staff to do snow removal. And these are guys that in the summertime do gardening and landscaping, things like that. And the good part of that is that our snow removal costs, pretty much just consists of things like overtime and things along those lines. So while a city like ours will spend maybe $500,000 a year on snow removal in a typical winter, a city like Fall River, for example, which contracts out, they spend $1.2–1.3 million a year, and they're smaller. Yeah. So so that's kind of the logic behind that. This made us decide, we probably ought to keep the current model as best we can. So, but we're always looking at ideas. What
about the school system? I know that sounds radical, but is that
so? There's been some talk about looking at the cafeteria function, and contracting out there. There was I'm not my position does not, I'm not the business manager for the school department. They're semi-autonomous. But I know there's been some look at that. We have, there's always consultants looking at different ideas. I think that they had I guess it was a few years ago, that whole Empower Schools initiative, which, didn't go through. That was not exactly a privatization, but it was definitely a different approach. It was almost like an in-house charter approach. For the reasons they decided not to proceed with that. So, we're always open and looking at ideas.
All right, 508-996-0500. Let's get to your calls. We're going to start right here for Ari Sky, and you're first this hour on 1420 WBSM. Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Sky. 12 years ago, when Fred Careless left office, the unfunded liabilities to the pension fund were $190 million. 12 years later, under two different mayors, that both attorneys, I have to point that out, we have a $488 million. I think it might be over $500 million now, unfunded liability to the pension funds. What is the major contributor to that? And what's going to happen? It has to be paid off. Am I correct? We have so many more years to be to pay that off.
Yeah.
That unfunded liability.
So the couple things, just to, since we're in budgeting 101, I might get a little academic. So if I sound patronizing, please stop me. The city's pension program, the city doesn't actually have its own pension program. The pension program is actually a regional program. The city owns about 85% of the liability. I believe you're talking about the total liability in the pension system. So that $400 million, we're 85% of that. The thing that's driving it more than anything else is longevity. People are living longer, and people who, in certain positions, especially public safety positions, have the option and ability to retire fairly young, 50 or 55 years old, as well as longtime city employees. A number of them can retire at 55 under the old pension plan as well. Those benefits levels are not set by the city. Those benefits levels are set entirely by the state in legislation. So there's not much we can do. The only role that the pension board has is to manage the funds, try to get a decent return, and they do get a good return. A few years ago, it was 17%. I'm not sure what the number is for last year. It hasn't been set yet. And they have the ability to grant COLAs and things like that for retirees, which they tend to do because they're trying to, protect their members. So the nature of the pension plan is kind of on a trajectory that's sort of set. What we're responsible for doing is ensuring that there's a payment schedule that gets us to a point where we're fully funded. By 2040 is the law. We're actually at a 2034 schedule, so we're a little bit ahead of the legal requirement. And the city plan is about 50% funded, a little bit less than 50% funded. I think it was 48.7 or 48.8% as of last year. I don't know what it is, or as of 2016. I don't know what it is as of 2017. So, and every year that number goes up. It's always a discussion I have with the mayor because he'd like to use the money elsewhere if he could, but he also knows the importance of of meeting our liabilities. So it's always it's always a difficult situation. But that cost goes up by about $1 to $1.1 million every year. So we're playing catch up, and we're putting a little more into the system every year.
Thanks for the call, my friend. Appreciate it. You're up next with Ari Sky on 1420 WBSM. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Sky. First of all,
hi, good afternoon.
I watch you a lot on the city council meetings, and I think you're a blessing to the city. I think your clarity and your honesty and knowing the numbers is paramount in keeping the city in order. So I just want to tip my hat regarding that. Regarding the pensions, we have these various enterprise funds, and I think this may be a good idea or approach for the city so that any new employee that is working out of the enterprise funds, instead of joining the pension system, be offered a reduced factor with a 401k to help reduce the liability of the city over time. And I think if we started now and at least gave that a try, we could see how it worked and the numbers that would ensue, so that in the future, any future employee across the board would be offered the 401k plan versus the current pension plan that we have. I don't know if that takes legislation or not, but simply to reduce that liability number that you're talking about. The other idea was we have a probably over $100 million a year payroll from the city to city employees, many of whom don't live in the city. I was thinking that even if we came up with a small tax on employees that don't live in the city and use that money to reduce the pension fund. But those are just a couple of ideas that I had. And my only question is, you had mentioned earlier in the show that there's going to be 2 more hirees in the enterprise fund. Which one? Is it the traffic commission?
No, there are 2 more employees proposed, 2 more positions proposed for the general fund. There are several positions proposed for the enterprise funds, mostly things like water, sewer. I think it's a water, sewer maintenance worker, a project coordinator, things along those lines. The general fund, there's a position in the solicitor's office and a position in the planning department.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this then. For those city employees, I guess we'll call them, that are being paid out of the enterprise fund, Are their retirement
Yes.
benefits paid by the general fund?
Yes, they're paid by the general fund, but the enterprise fund pays the general fund for the cost.
So there is a liability for the enterprise fund. So if I work under the enterprise fund for 20 years and it's time to retire, my retirement benefits are actually paid by the enterprise fund to the city, like that.
What happens is that assessment, which will include, the city pays an assessment to the retirement boards, and we're almost $29 million in FY19, and the general fund that's paid out of the general funds just for ease of purpose in a single place, but the general fund bills out to the different enterprise funds, and they pay their share into the general fund.
Okay, so these enterprise funds need a lot more focus, in my opinion. I mean, I look at the sewage treatment plant and the bond that the city had to float for that, which I think was $220 million when it started. The enterprise fund wasn't in play at that point in time, and city employees were being paid directly out of the general fund. When the enterprise fund came into play, I think the number of employees in that particular enterprise fund is well over 100. So the liability and the pension piece isn't as focused upon. But you take, just for example, a gentleman like Ron LaBelle, who was there, and I think all of his salary over the years came out of the enterprise fund and received various raises so that his pension piece is going to be much higher. That liability is going to be paid for the people paying their sewer bills. Forever.
That's let me you had a lot of stuff there. Let me unpack it all if I can. So first of all, your question about pensions, we don't have the ability to offer a 401k. The pension benefits are set by the state. There was a pension reform that went through in 2012. Unless the state does another pension reform where they decide to move away from a defined benefit plan and allow us to offer, a defined contribution plan to new employees, then we're stuck with what we've got. Residency, there is a Supreme Court ruling, I believe, about residency taxes for out of state, for out of town employees. I don't believe we're able to do that. There was some discussion about that a few years ago between the city council and the solicitor's office. As far as sewer and water, a couple things to keep in mind. One of the reasons why there's some big costs there in bonds, capital expenses, is that our system's under a consent order. It's a very old system that requires a lot of repair. The Department of Public Infrastructure has, over time, gradually begun working on improving those, making the renovations where they needed to. Without getting too technical, the biggest issue is what they call sewer separation. The old systems have a single line for storm sewer and for sewage, and as a result, the wastewater treatment plant gets overloaded, and you get flushes into the ocean, which the government doesn't want you to do. So the program that's underway right now is all about doing those sewer separations. That was the big project in Cogs Hall Street recently. There's one going on near my neighborhood soon, and there are other things they have in play as well as IT improvements and things along those lines at the wastewater at the plant. Water and sewer are very expensive businesses, but someone like Mr. LaBelle, he's retired now. He's receiving retirement benefits. That money's coming from the pension fund or the pension system. In other words, there's no longer an assessment for him coming out of the departments. What's coming out of the departments is the assessment, the pay down for those costs over time for the future retirees, so they can be paid using the funding that the pension fund has. The idea of becoming fully funded means that you have all that money in that you need to have for your current and future retirees, which is what we're trying to move toward.
Tom, appreciate your call. Thank you very much, my friend. And Tom's former city councilor, so he knows a lot of the ins and outs of this that the rest of us probably don't understand. So I'm glad that we got Tom in. Let me take a quick break. We'll come right back, and we'll have time for a couple more. So stay with us. You're listening to 1420 WBSM. All right, 2:55 on a Friday afternoon. A few minutes left with Ari Sky, who's the chief financial financial officer. Thank you. Well, all day long, I've been afraid I was going to call you Ari Fleischer.
Call me the green eye shade guy.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
I see Ari Fleischer come up on TV behind you there through the day, and I'm saying, Ari Fleischer, no. I don't think I've ever met anybody named Ari before.
So the great thing about the Bush administration, in my mind, was that it made my name commonplace.
There you go.
People used to pronounce my name all the time, not anymore. It's great.
What is Sky? Where's that come from?
It is originally Latvian.
Really?
It was pronounced Shkoy. And then when my family came over in the early 1900s, you go to Ellis Island and they say, I don't know how to, and the immigration officer says, I don't know how to spell Shkoy. Let's make it Sky.
Sky. You're Sky from now on. Yeah. All right. 508-996-0500. Thanks for hanging on. You're next with Ari Sky.
Hello.
Hi.
Could you tell me what the plans are for the New Bedford rifle range?
Well, there is a study underway or discussion underway with the police and we're using our facilities department and the members as well to look at the possibility of creating what we call a revolving loan fund, which is basically it's like a mini version of an enterprise fund that would allow us to take revenue from the range, pump it back into the range and maintain it. Just for the public's information, the rifle range is quite an asset. It's actually located in Dartmouth, but the city owns the property, and I believe it's one of the only really fully sized rifle ranges in the area. So it's kind of an underused resource.
All right, my friend, appreciate the call. I'm going to grab another one. You're next on WBSM. Good afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi.
I just have a quick question. Are we buying any apparatus this cycle for the fire department?
I believe this is an off year. We've purchased, 5 apparatus in the past 3 or 4 years. I believe the capital plan has one next year, is the next one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate the call. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a fire, police. I mean, those are big areas.
Big drivers.
Yeah,
they're big drivers.
So we're not getting safer money anymore. That's all gone, right?
Right. So it's kind of a good news, bad news. The bad news is we don't have the safer money. The good news is that we don't have to worry about the safer money. Safer was always intended as kind of a bridge stopgap kind of funding. It was really something that originated during the recession. And was something to allow departments to be able to maintain staffing despite hardship. It really saved the city's bacon over the period of the 9C cuts, the big cuts that the state instituted around 2009, 2010, that kind of thing, and allowed the city to maintain its staffing. So the good news is that the 2019 budget allows us to fully fund those positions. It's a challenge to the budget, and it's an upward pressure. It's about $800,000 this year, and it's going to be about $1.4 million next year. We were able to stretch the money we have into November, which is why it's in the full year's worth this year. It's a priority to try to be able to maintain funding for that group.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of communities, what wound up happening is they hired back a lot of folks that have been laid off, only to let them go again when the safer.
I mean, it really is. Between the cost, the fire department, the mayor talked about this during his presentation. The fire department's budget, because of sort of the rollback from safer, not to mention the debt service on the new fire apparatus, things like that. The fire department's budget has increased by about 28% over the past 3 or 4 or 5 years, so quite a bit.
How much of that is personnel?
Most of it. By far the most of it. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. But between that and the pressure we have on healthcare and things like that, it's really hard to kind of manage a budget and to achieve, which is also the mayor's goal, to try to keep the tax levy down as far as possible.
So we're out of time. So I was going to ask you about police contracts, but we don't have enough time to let you answer it because we got about 40 seconds left. So want to thank you for coming in. Hopefully we can get you in here again soon.
Absolutely, anytime.
A lot of interesting stuff, and I thought it was a good lesson in a way that people can understand how the city budget works. And
we can do budgeting 201 in a
there you go. Yeah. Because a lot of people think that the government has like this magic box of money somewhere, and if they really want it, they can just dig into it and pay for it. Ari Sky, thanks. Appreciate it. You have a great weekend.
Thank you.
I got to get out of here. It's time for the news. Howie Carr is on the other side. Sunday is Mother's Day, so take good care of Mom, right? Make sure, Mom's taken care of. Take her out to eat. Do something nice for her. And we'll look forward to talking to you again on Monday. News is next. Howie Carr on the other side. Be well, everybody.